Good evening. My name is Bao Tran, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. When we held Clark Forum events in person and on campus, we took a moment to acknowledge the land on which we inhabit belonged to indigenous people for centuries before European settlements. Currently, I'm inhabiting the ancestral land of the Lenape, the Susquehannock, the Conestoga, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, the Erie, and later the Indian children of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. I encourage everyone watching this evening program to take a moment after our presentation to acknowledge the tribes whose traditional land you currently inhabit. On behalf of Dickinson College, Clark Forum, and the Women's and Gender Resource Center, I would like to welcome you to tonight's keynote event for Dickinson's Gender Week, the representation of women in the US Congress. In 2019, as the 116th Congress was sworn in, the American public celebrated the most diverse national legislative body elected in history. The 116th Congress included 127 women, 100 of whom were elected into the House of Representatives for the first time. Notably, the first two Muslim women and the first two indigenous women were sworn into the House. Despite these statistics, many women face challenges to running for public office, and the differences between the number of women in Congress across the partisan line are significant. In addition, as of 2020, the US had a slightly lower percentage of women in Congress than the world did in 2018. Dr. Kira Sanbonmatsu is a political scientist who teaches and studies gender, race, ethnicity, parties, public opinion, and state politics at Rutgers University. Currently, she's also a senior scholar at the Center for American Women and Politics of the Eagleton Institute of Politics. She has co-authored multiple books and reports, including the report Where Women Run, Gender and Party in the American States in 2006, the report Poised to Run, Women's Pathways to the State Legislatures in 2009, the book More Women Can Run, Gender and Pathways to State Legislatures in 2013, two reports Representation Matters, Women in the US Congress in 2017, and the Money Hurdle in the Race of Governor in 2020, and her most recent co-authored book, A Seat at the Table, Congresswomen's Perspectives on Why Their Present Matters in 2018. Her articles have appeared in journals such as American Journal of Political Science, Politics and Gender, and Political Research Quarterly. As a college student, diversity of race, gender, and social economic background has been an important ideal for me and my college community. I hope tonight's event catalyzes more discussion on diversity in our classrooms and inspires students, particularly young women, women of color, and those coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, to achieve whatever aspirations they have in the future. There will be a question and answer session following the presentation at any time. So please type your question into the live chat next to the YouTube video at any time. Please post questions only in the live chat feature. This is not the space for exchanging personal opinions during the speaker's presentation. Thank you for attending, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Kira Sanbonmatsu.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I want to thank Professor Mark Aldrich and everyone at the Clark Forum for hosting me. And I want to thank the students I met with earlier today in Women's and Gender Studies. It's such a great opportunity to share what we do at the Center for American Women in Politics. And I hear that the campus is headed out on spring break soon, which is also true at Rutgers University. And so thanks for joining yet another Zoom, and we're almost at the end of this pandemic. That's what they tell me. So I want to share some slides with you and tell you about some of our work around women in elections, women's office holding. As you could hear from those titles of some of my work, I look a lot at women running. Tonight, I'm going to talk more about women holding office. And as Bao mentioned, I look forward to hearing some questions from you at the end. At the Center for American Women in Politics, we love data and we love to share our data. And so I wanted to invite you, not right now while I'm speaking, but in your free time while you're on spring break, to visit our website and take a look at what we have there. We are a research and education center. We're in our 50th anniversary, and we are based at the Eagleton Institute at Rutgers, New Brunswick. We are bipartisan, and one of our main missions is to share facts with the world, with students, with the media, with the public about women's office holding. Historically, currently, we also look at women's candidacies, and we do conduct research that would help us better understand and promote women's political participation in all respects. We also have programs aimed at educating women who are running for office and training young women to get more interested in leadership. So I thought maybe the first place to start with thinking about women and representation is to look at the numbers. Our data show that we are at historic levels of women's office holding. Women right now are 27% of the US House. That's 118 women, 24% of the US Senate. Statewide elective executive positions, about 31%. Those are offices such as governor, secretary of state, attorney general. State legislature, women are about 31% as well, historic high. And of course, every state has a state legislature, so there are a lot of opportunities at the state level for women's office holding. It goes without saying that we're at a historic moment with not only our first woman vice president, but we also have the House led by Speaker Nancy Pelosi. So this is quite an interesting time to be talking about women's representation. I will flag for you, though, that these percentages, as high as they are and as historic as they are, women are not at parity, of course. Women are actually a majority of voters, and so they are underrepresented still, despite a lot of gains. Women governors are also underrepresented. Only 8 women currently serving as governor, so definitely 8 out of 50 is not a great percentage. I want to turn to where we stand with women of color specifically, and we do have our data broken down by race and ethnicity, and this is based on how women self-identify, of course. In the US House, there are 47 women of color, and in the Senate, 3 women of color. We know that most of these women are Democrats. There are just 5 of these women of color in Congress now identify as Republicans. And although I want to focus your attention tonight on Congress, I will say a few words about state legislatures, and I have a pretty graph from our website or map to share with you. And what we see here is that the states are really different with respect to women's representation. And so actually where you live has a lot to do with what you see in terms of women's office holding. And then that has implications for how women aspire to be in politics and what it means to run in different states. So overall, women are 31% of state legislators, but actually in Nevada, women are a majority of the legislature. That's the first time that has ever happened in US history. In some states, women's representation is much lower, 20%, less than 15%. I did look up Pennsylvania, 29%, so a little bit below average, but not terrible. And in this color-coded map, the gold color is the states with the highest presence of women in the legislature, and the gray, the lowest. Pal mentioned that women candidates have been very much in the news lately, and I just wanted to remind you about that. You probably saw tremendous news coverage in 2018 about women candidates, and even 2020, a lot of focus on women candidates as well. 1992, if you remember back then, was the so-called Year of the Woman election. At that time, there were a record number of women running for Congress. So there was a lot of discussion in the press about whether 2018 was the new Year of the Woman or not. And we were following this very closely at the center. I wanted to show you just a couple of statistics just to put today's numbers in perspective about women's office holding. And what you can see here, we have our data by political party with Democratic women in blue and Republican women in red. Not terribly original on my part. 1992, the Year of the Woman, this is raw number of women who entered primaries for the US House. And what you can see is that if you go to 2018, 2020, right, it really puts 1992 in perspective. 1992 was a record year, and you can see why jumping to 2018, you read a lot about women candidates in the news. There were a lot of women running. They were disproportionately Democratic. You could see in 2020, the red column is harder to see in 2018 compared to the Democrats because so many more Democratic women ran. But in 2020, you could see that Republican women's candidacies for the US House ticked up a little bit. So these are women who ran. Let's see who won their primaries and were nominated by their party. I'm going to move on to the next chart. Here we have number of women nominated again, 1992 up through 2018, 2020. And again, kind of similar to the primary entrance, you can see that we've had a big uptick just recently, but also that there is a differential between the two parties. The Democratic women who ran in 2018 were record-breaking. They also disproportionately succeeded in their primaries, and they helped flip seats for their party, and they helped the Democrats take over the House, as you may recall. Now, another way of thinking about what we're seeing right now in terms of women in politics is to take a look at the women who are serving in Congress and think about how they measure up within each party, because party is so important to legislative politics. Here I'm showing you the percentage of women as a share of House members, Democrats and Republicans. And this chart extends from 1971 to 2021. In the 70s, one thing to note is how small a proportion women were in both parties. And what you can see is that over time, the two parties have really pulled apart here. The blue chart, the blue columns here are women as a share of all Democrats in the House. The red columns, harder to detect because they're so much shorter, Republican women as a share of Republicans in the US House. And what you can see over here is that the 2018 election had really different implications for women of the two parties. And here we can see that in this most recent cycle, Republican women regained a bit of where they had been, but they still are less than 15%. Less than 15% of all Republicans in the House today are women. But look at Democratic women at 40%. They are approaching parity within their party. So two really different types of trends that we're seeing. So this, you might be saying, well, okay, that's where the numbers stand. So one way of thinking about women's representation is, what are the numbers? How many are there? From how many states? Which parties? And how has this changed historically? But you might be asking yourself, well, okay, but so what? Right? What difference does it make? What do women do when they get there? What are these women in Congress doing? And do the numbers matter? And at the center, we care a lot about the data, we care a lot about the facts, but we also care about women's leadership, and we care about understanding what it means to represent women. our book project, so I'm going to spend the rest of my time tonight sharing with you some of the findings from our book project that Bao mentioned, which is called A Seat at the Table. And it's all about the effects and perspectives of women in Congress. I'm going to just go back to a couple of slides now. Now, we're not the first to think about what it means to represent women in Congress. And I want to just briefly tell you a little bit about the research in this area. I was meeting with students earlier today, and one of the things that I noted is that one takeaway from the research, and there's been a lot of research at the state legislative level, congressional level, at different points in time, and often thinking about the question, does descriptive representation or the presence of women in office lead to substantive representation? Right? Is there something about having women in Congress or in state legislatures that enhances the policy, that enhances what American women get out of government? And one of the most consistent differences, or what findings from a lot of research, is that you tend to see gender differences in legislative politics at the bill introduction stage in terms of agenda setting. So women and men emphasizing different issues when they develop their portfolios of what they want to work on, what it is that they want to represent. But we also know from a lot of research, and it probably won't surprise you, that political parties are very important. And women are in both parties. They're better represented in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party, but they are in both parties and they are partisans. So when you look at different stages of the legislative process, tend to see that when you get to how people vote on the floor, that is typically pretty partisan. I'm kind of, these are generalizations, but I want to just acknowledge that we're not the first ones to look at this. And most of the time, the data that people in political science use to study this tend to be objective measures of behavior. Right? You can analyze bills and what's in them. You can look at votes and count those up. So a lot of that research is quantitative, which is very valuable. We also know that partly from research that the center had been engaged in previously, women legislators often feel a responsibility to represent women broadly, not just the women in their constituencies within the confines of their districts. And this is a concept of surrogate representation. Right? And this is the feeling that even if women aren't in their district, maybe women in general, that there's a set of feeling that women legislators should represent women writ large. And we also know that representation is dynamic. We know that which party is in control matters. And we know that the issues of the day change. And we know that which women are serving and who they are, what their ideologies are, what parties that they are. This is a fluid situation. And what meaning is attached to different issues changes as well. So this is, I think, a lot of interesting work that has been done. We take a different approach in our book, A Seat at the Table. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Professor Kelly Dittmar and Susan Carroll, also of the Center for American Women in Politics. Our book was published in 2018, was really interested in understanding women's perspectives. How do women serving in Congress see their roles? So we took a qualitative approach, an interview approach, and we sought interviews with all the women serving in the 114th Congress. And that was the Congress that was primarily meeting in 2015, 2016. This was pre-Trump. This was when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were running for president. And we wanted to know how women saw their roles. We're interested in the role of parties and how women see partisanship, because we are in a very partisan era nowadays. And we were also interested in women of color perspectives, because at that time, there were more women of color serving than had been in the past, although the numbers have risen since then. And this was a multi-year major project that we engaged in with the help from a funder. Debbie Walsh, the director of the center, helped with interviews, as did one of our graduate students who's now a professor, Kathy Weiniger. And we interviewed women in the House and Senate. We were really privileged to have a chance to interview 77%, so the majority of the women serving the 114th Congress, and these were mostly in-person interviews. So I want to highlight a couple of things that we found in our research, and I want to draw out some of the ways that women thought women per se were important, as well as what they individually were seeking to do while they were serving in Congress. And I want to also talk about some of the barriers that they saw that they faced as women, and whether they saw any at all, as well as opportunities. And I'm going to mostly do this by sharing this summaries of what the interviews revealed, and also share some quotes with you about how women see their role. I'm going to start with policy, because I think that that is top of mind for everyone with respect to Congress. And as I mentioned, we do know that there are agenda setting effects from past research. And we asked the women we interviewed, who are you trying to represent? Who do you see as important? And of course, they talked about the needs of their districts. They talked about the needs of their states if they were in the Senate. And they told us what issues were important to their constituents. They also told us about how their personal experiences, their backgrounds, their occupations, their family lives played a role in their approach to policy as well. But we also wanted to know, in addition to the districts that they represented, in addition to the states that they represented, are there any other groups that they seek to represent? And a lot of different groups came to mind. And virtually all of the women we interviewed spoke about women when we asked this open-ended question, or subgroups of women, because women are a very large group. And they often saw a need to have women in office because of the different life experiences that women have on average differences with men. And so, for example, there would be issues that maybe never get discussed in the legislature or had not been discussed in Congress until women brought them in. And this was articulated here by Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida. She said, right, there are just issues that would not have reached the top of the agenda without women there pushing to make sure. On the quote from Representative Alma Adams is similar. If we're not here, the issues that need to be talked about the most won't be talked about. And I have a quote from Representative Marcia Fudge of Ohio, who argued that it's very important that caregiving perspectives that are often brought by women are in the legislative debate. And she said, quote, I think it is really important that people who are basically caregivers, that people who basically run our households, are the people who make decisions about what goes on in those households. Right? So you're getting a sense of advocacy for women as being important, women legislators being associated with those issues. Other topics that came up were women's health. And here, Representative Jackie Walorski, of Republican of Indiana, mentioned violence against women in particular, and that definitely came up as well in the course of our interviews. We were especially interested in whether women of color saw distinctive issue agendas facing women of color. So we asked Black women in Congress, do Black women have a distinctive agenda as Black women? Same, we asked for Latinas and Asian American women. And more often than not, what the women told us is that they didn't necessarily see a specific agenda so much as that they have a perspective that then can translate over all issues, or a lens. And this is articulated by Representative Fudge, who said, I don't know that I would say an agenda, but I think we probably have different priorities. I mean, I think our agenda is a democratic agenda, especially because most of us are Democrats, but I think, yeah, we do have some different priorities because we come from very different communities. And they talked about their districts. Maybe they are disproportionately Black and Latina. Maybe they are disproportionately immigrant, but they are very in tune with their districts, and they are very aware of the way that both race and gender play a role in shaping their own personal experiences, as well as the lives of their constituents. Interestingly, part of the presence of women in Congress is about educating other members, right? Other members of Congress about their communities. And this was one example, a Latina Congresswoman, Representative Roybal Allard, who told us that she needed to, when she first entered the institution, educate other members of Congress about the Latino community. And she said in the early 90s, she would encounter colleagues in Congress who didn't really understand the different ethnic groups under the Latino umbrella. So she said, quote, I literally had to explain to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle what the difference was between me and Nydia Velasquez. They'd say, you're Latino, you speak Spanish. What is the difference between you two? Well, she was Puerto Rican. Roybal Allard was a Mexican American. And so she said, we had to help people understand the perspectives of Latino communities. Senator Mazie Hirono, who is senator from Hawaii, born in Japan, talked about the significance of her presence in debates in the Senate about immigration reform. And she told us, quote, I would say mine was the only voice in the Judiciary Committee that spoke for the importance of family unity in debates over immigration reform. She said, not only because I was a woman, but as an immigrant, quote, because you have different life experiences, different perspectives, and women certainly bring that to any committee they are on. And she argued that is why it is important to have minority representation on all of these committees. And the women we interviewed were just emphatic. And I always tell young people this because I think it is so important. When you speak to elected officials and women in particular, they always say, and these women told us, it really matters who is at the table, and it matters who is in the room. And they definitely saw this as significant for what it meant to them to be women serving in Congress. Another way that they saw an impact is in terms of the process, in terms of the life of the institution, how policy is made, how Congress conducts itself. And a lot of them spoke about a different work style that they saw women having. And I want to share screen, and I'm just not able to do everything right here tonight. I was trying to be very dynamic by going back and forth, but I'm not as good at it as I should be. This was represented in a quote by Anna Eshoo, who said that, quote, I don't think women come here to be somebody. I think we come here to get things done. I don't think women come here to be somebody. I think we come here to get things done. And so this we heard from Democrats and Republicans. We heard this from, not from everyone, but it was a theme that came out about what women might bring that's different to the legislative process. Some of the women told us that women are more hardwired, and that's why hardwired differently, and that's why they're able to get things done. Some of them argued women are more likely to be multitaskers than men, and that's why they're more effective in Congress. Kathy McMorris Rogers, who's a Republican, argued that women seem to be less interested in the career ladder, and they want to make a difference in terms of policy. Senator Boxer from California told us that women senators are problem solvers rather than problem makers. She said, "We have problem makers among senators who are men. We have none among women." And Cynthia Lummis told us that if we had more women, I think we'd have an opportunity to look farther out and do better planning. Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida told us if we had more women, not just in Congress, but who have the authority to make big decisions and who are empowered to make things happen, we can get better things done. And not surprisingly, Democratic women spoke about Pelosi. She was minority leader before she became speaker. And they talked about the significance of having a woman in that leadership position and how Pelosi, helped elevate other women in the Democratic caucus. We were also told about some of the challenges and opportunities of being women in Congress. Now, I will tell you that they were more likely to talk about challenges than opportunities, but I am going to tell you about some opportunities. Some of the challenges were on the campaign trail. Some of the interviews talked about challenges within the institution. But throughout, there was a thread of sexism that women encounter that they told us about in politics, still being male-dominated fields, although some of the longer-serving women emphasized how much had changed for women in politics over the years. When they did encounter obstacles, they also told us how they were able to defeat them. And I'll share a quote from Barbara Lee, who's talked about some of the intersectional challenges that Black women face in Congress. She said, quote, "I think women of color will call it like it is really fast if they are being messed over in the process. You know it when you're being jerked around on something and you're not going to tolerate it. That's just not our history." And interestingly, some of the challenges that women face can be commonalities. They can create a shared sense of being women and could potentially create camaraderie. This is reflected here in Representative Dina Titus's remarks. Quote, "I think women have in common the fact that they have to overcome the obstacle of being a woman, whether they're a Democrat or Republican. There are obstacles that they all face, and this gives them a common bond." And you see the same thing from Kathy McMorris Rogers here on the Republican side. We did ask about whether women in Congress perceived women to be more bipartisan than men. This is something that you often hear about, that maybe there's something different about having women in office on this dimension. And the women we interviewed, most of them, did feel that women in Congress are more likely to be bipartisan than their male colleagues. We were also interested in why, what drives that? And part of it gets back to the previous slide, right? That if there is a marginalized experience, this can create potential for solidarity. They also talked about some single-sex spaces within Congress that created solidarity and some personal friendships. There's a bipartisan Congresswomen's softball game. That's an annual fundraiser for cancer research, and women in Congress, play together on this team against women in the media. And through this teamwork and practice, some of them had built friendships across party lines. Senator Barbara Mikulski, long-serving member of the Senate, while she was in the Senate, started a tradition of bipartisan dinners of women across party lines in the Senate that went on, that are still going on. And some of the women we interviewed, more newly elected to the US House, their class of women had been meeting for dinner socially across party lines. The work style differences between perceived between women and men is also a theory for why women might be able to bridge partisan differences. This is mentioned here by Senator Baldwin. More women go into politics to get something done, and Representative Walorski, who told us women want to make a difference. We're leaving our homes to come to Congress, to be here, and we're saying, I want to fight for X. So the idea is that maybe because women really want to be effective, they find ways to transcend partisanship. Now, we do talk in the book about some of the very significant, of course, policy differences among women in Congress. And party has become a sharper distinction between women. And we, during the 114th Congress, heard about immigration, reproductive rights, gun rights, and issues that women were working on both sides, right? So you had women, Democrats leading pro-choice advocacy, Republican women taking the pro-life position, both groups of women very strongly in support of different policies. And then I can't see you out there, but I think you've been a great audience so far. But I will tell you, I'm coming near the end of my talk. I did want to leave you with some opportunities that women told us about. Interestingly, the flip side of facing sexism and being assumed that you're not going to be up to the job is an opportunity, some women told us. This is reflected here in Representative Michelle Lujan Grisham's remarks, where she said, quote, I think too often, particularly in this institution, women are underestimated. That can play to our strength because they don't think you can do it. All the women we interviewed want to see more women in politics. And they think it's really important that there be more women in politics. And they see this as their opportunity and their responsibility. Susan Brooks told us, I think we have to change the mindset, not only of girls in encouraging them to run or consider leadership, we have to change the minds of boys and boys who support girls. Joyce Beatty of Ohio, quote, having more women of color in Congress makes a difference when little African-American girls can dream that they too can serve in Congress. They want to bring other women and girls along. So I've shared with you tonight then, our research on the 114th Congress found that women see distinctive policy and process contributions, that they face challenges, commonalities, there are bipartisan possibilities, and they feel this opportunity and responsibility to represent women and bring more women into politics. And I want to take your questions, but before I do, I want to close with one quote from Representative Yvette Clarke of New York, who talked to us about women in Congress being important because she said that women in Congress are an instrument to amplify the voices of women in the electorate, that women in Congress amplify the voices of women in the electorate. And she said, quote, I think this is an ongoing conversation because we will run into women who will say, well, you know, so you're a woman in Congress. That's no big thing. But actually, it is. So that's Congresswoman Clarke. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Sanbonmatsu, for your presentation. And this is now the start of the question and answer session. The first question from one member of the audience is, because organizations like Running Start, Emily's List, Mackie's List, She Should Run have a harder time recruiting Republican women, do you think recruiting strategies organizations should stick with emphasizing women's gender, particularly for Republican women who are not running and winning at those same numbers, or take on a different route?
So it's the question, do we need more of those organizations?
No, the question is like, do you think recruiting strategies should stick with emphasizing women's gender, particularly for Republican women who are not running and winning at those same numbers?
I see.
Or do we
Thank
take a different route?
Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you. I understand now. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So there are these organizations. You can see organizations across the spectrum interested in women running, but they do tend to be Democratic. Emily's List, some of it bipartisan, fewer on the Republican side. I guess I would say that I think that gender conscious recruitment is necessary on the Republican side, because without it, we're seeing such low numbers, and there is a gender gap. So we know that women voters, hew more Democratic, but that gap is much smaller than the gap you see in who's holding office in Congress. So my argument is there's so many more Republican women out there. I think that without self-conscious recruitment of those women, it's not happening naturally. And I think that the women who were able to be successful this cycle, Republican women, they were recruited, many of them benefited from women's organizations and PACs supporting them, building the network, mentoring them. Now, those women can come from all different places. Right? Republican women can be found in all different occupations of different ideological stripes. So they can be found throughout America. But I do think that without concerted effort, I don't think the Republican Party is going to be able to raise their numbers.
The second question is, do voters assume that women politicians will represent women issues in a narrow fashion? For example, kids, family concerns, reproductive issues, or do they understand that all issues are women's issues?
Some of the women we interviewed talked about that all issues are women's issues. I think that when you see voters evaluating women candidates, I think they support candidates who take all kinds of policy issues. I think candidates are faced with choices about what they emphasize and what they focus on, what they want voters to think about them. But I do think that voters understand that there are lots of issues, and they see women as credible representatives of the party that they advocate for. I will say, I think that there's some divided opinion on this, but I still think that stereotypes play a role in how voters see women candidates. And we heard about this a little bit in the interviews for our book. So there are still ways that women candidates need to educate voters about who they are.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is, so is there a sense that women in Congress are more interested in progress, change, and or good government than their male counterparts?
It didn't come up a lot in our book, but there was a theme when we asked about this broad question about who they want to represent and who they see themselves representing. One of the themes was about representing the voiceless, marginalized groups. And so that was a theme out of some of our interviews and I think that comes from self-awareness of being underrepresented and wanting to hear and be in touch with perspectives that have not been included in the process.
One member of the audience want to point specifically to one of your findings, and they asked, does Dr. Sanbonmatsu see the findings from the 2015 to 2017 women in Congress being consistent with what we are seeing currently?
Great question. Our book is self-aware that we looked at the 114. And I think every Congress is different. Now, what we're seeing right now with attack on the Capitol, with the election of some more conservative Republican women in Congress. And we also have seen in the 2018 cycle, a lot of progressive Democratic women elected. The composition of Congress has changed. So I think that it remains to be seen what this Congress will look like. But I think when you look at some of the women, a lot of the women we interviewed are still serving. And we know that there is a lot of self-awareness of women in both parties about a lot of these themes that we found in the 114. So women are, they are self-conscious of their role as women in Congress. But I think it remains to be seen what happens in the 117.
Okay. One member of the audience asked, did any of the women try to emphasize party as a major sense of collectiveness rather than gender? If so, did that come from one party, or did that show up in both parties?
It's always hard to disentangle gender and party. They are both, right? They are both partisans. They are also women. The presence of women in the Democratic Party means that and the fact that Democrats are in the majority right now, women are playing more of a leadership role in the Democratic Party. So it is more likely that, the Democratic Party and Democratic women are the same thing. It's less likely on the Republican side, because there are fewer Republican women there are fewer women in leadership, that they can dictate their party's agenda as much. But I think party was important, to all of the women. Definitely some differences in interest in bipartisanship. Some of the women elected from swing districts were the most interested in trumpeting bipartisanship, because being from a swing district, they know that their constituents expect them to be able to work across party lines, because the district itself is a mix.
Okay, thank you. And the next question from the member of the audience is do you think bridging the gender gap is what the Democrats should do, even though it might hurt them electorally, as more women will come to associate themselves with the Republicans?
I think that nowadays, with the parties being competing so closely, we have an equally divided Senate right now, and the House is very competitive as well. So I think right now it's a hard sell to tell one party or the other to back a woman of the other party. I think that's a tough argument to make right now. But I will tell you something interesting that I meant to mention during my talk, which is that there was definitely a sense when we were doing our interviews that Democratic women wanted to see more Republican women in leadership. Speaker Boehner stepped aside during the 114th Congress unexpectedly and left an opening, which ended up being filled by Paul Ryan. But when we were on the Hill doing interviews, it wasn't clear who was going to emerge. And I interviewed several Democratic women who expressed dismay that Republican Cathy McMorris Rodgers wasn't being considered for a leadership role. And they really felt that she was a good leader and had a lot of potential, even though they were Democrats. So I think that it's interesting. You can see how you can see examples of women really wanting women from the other party to succeed.
In the last in the last answer, to the last question, you mentioned that the Senate is very divided right now, and I think that division is a reflection of the fact that political opinions become more polarized, heading towards opposite extremes in the recent years. And do you think that this reality will hurt women candidates, especially those who run for the Republican Party?
I think this is one of the reasons that Republican women aren't doing better. Historically, Republican women office holders, including Republican women in Congress, were from the moderate wing of the party. And today you can see Susan Collins, and before she retired, Olympia Snowe, also of Maine. So the difficulty of running as a moderate right now has made it harder, I think, for Republican women who historically have been from the moderate wing. So that polarization, and if you think about it, if the parties are polarized, and Democratic women tend to be more liberal than Democratic men in Congress, they tend to be elected from more liberal districts. Polarization, that doesn't hurt Democratic women, but as the Republican Party moves more conservatively, that means that a lot of Republican women might find it harder to win election.
Thank you. And the next question is like, if women are at a larger percentage of Congress, and as they are more heterogeneous, do you think there will be less of a sense of community among the women who are represented?
Mm-hmm. I think that is a possibility. I think it's when a group is larger, it's harder to get to know them personally. I think that's partly why Barbara Mikulski was able to hold dinners with all of the women senators across party lines. There weren't that many of them. They wrote a book together years ago called 9 and Counting. There were 9 of them that they had to convene for dinner. So in the House, you've got larger numbers and less of a likelihood that you're going to be able to unite those women together. That the numbers don't necessarily speak to differences. I think, though, that one of the benefits of electing more women to Congress and to all offices is because women are heterogeneous. They are heterogeneous. And so it's hard for a small number of women to be representative of women writ large. So in our interviews, women spoke about needing women throughout the institution, throughout the committees, in both chambers, in leadership roles. So it does increase, I think, differences among women. You bring more women in, hopefully they are going to represent different communities.
Yeah, thank you. Throughout your presentation, and of course, like throughout like many parts of your answer too, like it seems like it's such an issue that like there's a wide difference between the number of women who represent in Congress from the Democratic Party and from the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
And how like I just want to know what can we do differently to close such a gap in the future.
Mm-hmm. I think that part of it has to do with persuading women, potential candidates, that they are up to the task and that they should do this and that it's really worthwhile. Even when we were doing our interviews, Democrats were in the minority, and particularly the very liberal Democratic women we interviewed felt the most dissatisfied with Republicans controlling the US House because there was such an ideological gap there. But even those women were finding ways to make a difference. And really thought that it mattered. So I think part of it is persuading more women how important it is to get involved. But then it's also, I think, encouraging gatekeepers, party leaders, donors to support them. When women, most of the research comes to the conclusion when women run, women win, right? So if you take into account incumbency and district characteristics, women do great. And the problem is mostly that they don't run enough, not enough for running.
Thank you. And with respect to the ideology, is there a reason that women tend to be more liberal than men of the same party?
It boils down to maybe some differences in life experiences. Democratic women are more self-conscious about women's rights, aware of sex discrimination. Of course, all members of Congress can represent issues around sex discrimination, but particularly, I think, for women in politics who have experienced these issues, that they tend to be front and center to them. And women in general tend to be more supportive of an activist government and have life experiences, whether because of they work in jobs close to government or because of women's rights issues or childcare and the importance of the safety net. There are different reasons that women tend to hew more democratic.
Yeah. And with respect to like sex discrimination and misogyny, like do many of the Congresswomen you interview face frequent scrutinies regarding their work-family balance? For example, like they were told by people around them, or they were told by, like another candidates that they should not run for politics because of the traditional notion that women have to take on more responsibilities than men do in the family and in the home.
We heard about that in the interviews. Longer serving women talked about sexism that they encountered when they first started their careers, and they explained that it's gotten so much better, that a lot of those issues over time and with more women running, they have become less significant. Now, I think what we've seen in the last few cycles, 2018, 2020, we're seeing younger women. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York, AOC, is a great example. So we are seeing women breaking the mold here in terms of what's required and feeling empowered to run, whether they had held office before or not, and young kids or not. So even though there's scrutiny around that, actually women in Congress recently formed a Mothers Caucus because the women in Congress do feel that there continue to be obstacles and that they are asked questions about their kids that they don't see their male colleagues being asked. So definitely something that persists.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for mentioning AOC as she's such a prominent figure right now, like to young people and such an inspiration. And I kind of want to ask like this second to last question: how do we create more opportunities for women, especially people of color, to run for office, like people like AOC?
Part of it, I think, gets to finances. I think a lot of the research around women in politics has focused on the existence of the candidate and the decision making going on in her mind about whether to run or not. And I've done a lot of that work myself, so I think it's all very important work. But sometimes people won't run if they don't think they're going to have financial support, or sometimes they enter but then they drop out. And for people of color and women of color, you have fewer personal resources on average. You probably don't have the same well-heeled networks as a white male candidate on average has access to. So I definitely think that part of the challenge is having a support base and then having people step up to support a range of candidates. And so they have to be encouraged to run, but then they also have to be supported, because money doesn't buy votes, but it sure helps get your message out. And resources are very important.
Yeah. I think this will be the last question from the member of the audience. And the United States is regarded as like one of the most developed nations in the world, but like as of 2020, like the number of women represented in the United States Congress is likely lower than the average percentage of like the world national legislative bodies in 2018. And what accounts for such a number? Like could we have done better?
Yeah, those numbers always surprise people who are not familiar with them, because we like to think of ourselves as leaders of the world on lots of different dimensions. And on this one, we really are not. And it's amazing to have a woman president, but the vice president, but the woman president box remains unchecked. One of the structural reasons that has been offered for this difference is our first past the post, winner take all electoral rules. And there can only be one winner for most of our offices. In other countries with proportional representation, there's a list that provides opportunities to get women's names on those lists, and it's a way that seems to be a structure that seems to be associated with having more women in office. That's one hypothesis, but I don't think that there's any reason that the United States couldn't do better. And you saw the chart about Democratic women, and that is those are winner-take-all elections. There's no quota in the United States, so it is possible. It just takes will and resources. But there's no reason that women couldn't be doing better in the United States.
Yes, I agree. Thank you, Professor, very much for your answer. This is the end of tonight's event. Thanks, Professor Sanbonmatsu, for your presentation, and thanks to our audience members for listening and asking great questions. Have a good night.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks to everyone. And yeah, great questions. Really enjoyed the conversation.